Welcome back to the Biz Mafia podcast, where business gets made. Today, we have the privilege of interviewing a true titan in the aerospace industry, Stanley Kennedy Jr. With over 35 years of experience in aerospace engineering, Mr. Kennedy has played a pivotal role in heavy lift launch vehicles, upper stages, multiple spacecraft programs, and ground systems for both government and commercial customers. In 2021, Stanley sold his most recent company, Oakman Aerospace, to Redwire, which is now a publicly traded company on the New York Stock Exchange. Apart from his remarkable contributions to the aerospace industry, Stanley is deeply committed to nurturing future generations of space enthusiasts. Today, he's the co-manager of OTMV Holdings and chairman of the board for the Space Force Cadet Corps. Stanley, thank you for being on the show.
Good to be here. Thanks, Brian.
Hey, welcome, Stanley.
Yeah.
So to start, take us back, because this was an interesting nugget that we pulled when we were doing our research. Take us back to the day you witnessed the Apollo 16 lunar launch and how that moment just ignited your passion for aerospace.
Yeah, that was my hook. My dad was majoring in the U.S. Air Force at the time. We were stationed up in Washington, D.C. He got us up in the middle of the night. We drove down 95 and pulled up on the causeway right as the sun was coming up and watched the launch. And it was absolutely the coolest thing in the world. And it was like, that's what I want to do. And from that point on, it was, I'm going to be an aerospace engineer. Didn't know what it would take, but I was hooked.
From that point, right? Because generally, especially at that age, a lot of kids want to be, in certain professions, and then it changes through the years, but you stuck with it. So what was that journey? What did it look like kind of all the way up to Oakman Aerospace?
Oh, well, so it helps when your father is a colonel in the U.S. Air Force. Don't get me wrong. Fast forward, there's a bunch of stuff we're trying to do with underrepresented, underserved communities because, a lot of people get it. I sort of got it because I was told this is how we're going to go do it, but I wanted to do it. I went to school, got my degree, undergraduate degree, got out of school and started working for Martin Marietta in Littleton, Colorado back in 85. And I spent a great portion of the career, Lockheed Martin, fantastic company, and they've spawned off just tremendous innovation and everything else that goes along with it. But I did stints through Lockheed, went to General Dynamics, went back to Lockheed, and went to Comtech Aero Astro. And Comtech Aero Astro on Friday the 13th of July 2012 decided to close operations. And Maureen O'Brien and I at that point got together and decided that it was time to open up our own business. And we founded Oakman Aerospace and kept doing it for 10 years, almost 10 years. And somebody came along and decided they wanted to buy it. And we said, we're not for sale. And they said, everybody's for sale. And we worked through it and figured it all out. It actually was, it was very, very positive, and it's been just a tremendous, tremendous ride.
Pat, you were going to ask a question there.
Well, yeah. So tell us a little bit about Maureen, and ends up being a great business partnership.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like you work together at various companies, but that's something we get into a lot. Partnerships can be really additive. They're like a marriage. Yours worked. Tell us about it.
You bet. So at the time, I was general manager for commercial, civil, and international programs. She was the director of international affairs and all of the contracts and security work. We were actually at a conference in Europe, in London, 2 weeks before the 2012 Olympics. And we got the notice on Friday morning. Well, it was Friday afternoon in the UK, 9 a.m. East Coast time, on Friday the 13th, that the company was closing operations. And you got to remember, back in 2012, this is when the U.S. government was going through sequestration. There were a whole bunch of cuts, and everybody didn't know where monies were going to come from. And the company decided that they knew what it would cost to close the company. They didn't know what it was going to be costing to keep it open, and they decided to close operations. And so we very quickly, so that was Friday the 13th. We drank heavily that night. We woke up Saturday somewhat hungover and flew back home. Sunday, between Sunday and Tuesday that week, we put together a 73-page transition plan, and we presented it to the president of the company that had just recently closed. And we started to work an asset lease purchase agreement where we picked up the eventual assets of Oakman Aerospace. But specifically to
Wow.
your question on Marine and I are very symbiotic. I'm the engineer, thought process, wild idea guy, and she is the cool-headed implementer. Hey, you might want to think about, we shouldn't do this, blah blah blah. And it's a very yin yang give and take that was very successful for us.
That's a good balance. I think that it sometimes gets undervalued, right? Some people have their strengths and weaknesses, and you need somebody on the other side who has those strengths that are your weaknesses. And certainly, I'm sure through the growth within the organization, it was more important on some of the larger decisions you had to make.
Yeah, and even more important, and I think this is a little bit of advice for an individual entrepreneur. You got to seek somebody out that isn't going to be a yes man or a yes woman. Seek somebody out that is going to tell you your baby's ugly. Seek somebody out that's going to say you really don't want to put all 10,000 on 00. You need to hear some of that. That's probably not the wisest thing to do. And sometimes for entrepreneurs, it's hard. But I will preface with, both Maureen and I are reluctant entrepreneurs. We specifically got thrown into this, and quite frankly, if we knew what it was going to take when we made the decision, we would have thought even harder about making that decision, because it is hard. Entrepreneurship is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
It's a gritty grind. Going back to kind of that complementary angle, I think it's so important what you just said. So in my experience, I'm curious yours. I'll take somebody who's got enough technical acumen in a particular area, but they're not, they don't have to be the Steve Jobs of their particular technology, but they understand and they have a vision. And then there's this good business sense, which is very complementary with that. Those, in my experience, are the companies that tend to work. It isn't necessarily the company that's got the greatest tech. I mean, there's probably a million companies with unbelievable tech that we've never heard of because they didn't get anywhere, or the founder couldn't get out of their own way. I mean, is that sort of your opinion as well?
Guaranteed. I'm 100% behind that. You don't necessarily have to be the fastest runner. You need to know when to sprint, and you need to know when to walk and catch up on water and everything else. But again, I think that having a team, or at least people that you can talk to and bounce those ideas off of, are incredible, because you tend to start hearing your own thoughts coming back to you, and perception may become reality, and that's a bad deal, or vice versa. Reality is perceived, and so you just got to be a little careful with that.
I might be making a bigger deal of this than it was, but I mean, you did it a little bit differently. You went through the asset purchase first, right? And that had to have been a complex transaction of sorts. Was it as complex, or was it easier than maybe I'm visioning?
Well, at the time, it felt daunting. The interesting, and this is all openly available, we wrote a check for $8,500 to start Oakman Aerospace, and it was 100% owned by us. And what we did was we took on a whole bunch of lease and asset liabilities. In response, we got some of the intellectual property that had been developed at the company in the past. And again, with everything being positive, I think having what's the right focused and energized leadership to execute was the difference in turning that good technology into great products.
So if we can investigate Oakman a little bit more, tell us a little bit about what it does, or what it did, who it serves, and eventually what you grew it to be prior to the sale.
So the interesting part, we started out with sort of 3 lines of business. We had good smart systems engineering, which was really selling good smart ideas for $1.98 an hour to other companies, which over time you're going to put yourself out of business. The second one was our modeling and simulation environment, which became Acorn, which is now the digital engineering sort of center of the universe for what Redwire Space does. And then the last one was, we had some really smart folks like Jay Wilson and others, Casey Cadell, that did really cool boutique model sensing and payload sensors that were very niche market. But by having those 3, you could sort of fill in the peaks and valleys and keep going. And so it also helped that in 2012, we had just signed a contract. And so we had some runway when we did go in and tell our customers that, hey, Comtech is closing, we're picking up this part of the business, we want to stay your providers. And we had customers that went to the mat for us and they novated contracts and they helped us out. So it's as important to have those relationships with your customer base as well as your suppliers and everybody else.
Customers, right? So when you got started, it sounds like you had a nucleus of customers that wanted to get behind you, but take us through a little bit about how do you think of the government when it comes to space, right? And now there's a little more for us lay people. You hear about the SpaceXs, but what does customer acquisition look like? Who are you specifically working for? What are you build products and do engineering? What did the whole thing look like?
Well, in the beginning, it was getting out the Rolodex and calling anybody who, needed help and saying, can we help you do this stuff? Here's what we're good at. And we had a lot of people who, this is where we got thrown into being entrepreneurs. I'm not going to speak for Marine's age, but I was pushing into the 50s and my Rolodex was deep. I'd already been doing aerospace for decades. So you immediately start calling on the people who you've worked with in the past, have good relationships with, and that helped early on. We had a very good friend customer that went to bat for us and said, yeah, I can give you some startup money to get going, but I expect this product. And then we delivered on that product and it continued to move forward. I think it's always better to be lucky than smart. And it's always better to, I think preparedness brings you luck, puts you in position for luck. I think somebody has a much better way of saying that. But I truly believe that if you really work hard and you take good care of people, in the end, things will come your way. Not always. And we've got plenty of scar tissue of places where we thought we were doing the right thing and we may not have gotten what we thought we deserved. But the difference between success and failure is getting up one more time than you're knocked down. And I think that's what you got to do.
So true. So you hit on something I think is a really interesting point. Preparedness leads to success. Typically, experience leads to preparedness, right? And failure.
Yeah.
In the entrepreneur world, we tend to think of the Silicon Valley, super young, early 20s, 30s. But in our experience, the most successful entrepreneurs a lot of times built it when they were in their 50s. But there's a stereotype. So I want to dive into that because you became an entrepreneur in your 50s and the preparedness and probably things that went wrong helped you ultimately achieve that success because you experienced the failure. Is that fair?
We call that backside scar tissue. When you have a bad experience, to me, is that scar tissue that comes back and is always reminding you, hey, stove's hot, or yeah, that's pretty high thing to jump off of, yada, yada, yada. So I agree with you on preparedness and execution. I think if you go look at the average or the numbers in the literature, the average age of the entrepreneurs are 40, 45, something like that. I totally want as many 20-year-old entrepreneurs to be successful as I want 60-year-old entrepreneurs to be successful. A lot of times, if you don't know what you don't know, it's easier to have innovation and do something that's completely different. It's a little harder in aerospace because there's this thing called physics. And until you get past the derivation of F equals ma down into the equations of motion and everything else, you got to fundamentally change either material or something else to make a physics problem work properly. And a lot of times that's a lot of extra years in the business.
You brought up another point in comment about these customers in the early days that were there for you. They believed in you. They believed in what you were doing. They provided some capital. But through the growth and through that journey, how important was the customer's voice and ear, right, to either soundboard new ideas off of? Did you have much conversation and time with a lot of those customers to decide what's the next product or other that we should be looking at?
One of the things that we did early on, we did a quarterly 5-question survey. Very simple things. What are we doing right? What are we missing? What are we doing wrong? How do we change it? An open-ended, what could we do better to support what you need? And I mean, it's very basic stuff like that. And you'd be surprised that we'd go into a customer thinking, oh, we've got this. And we'd get those a quarterly back. And one of those 5, and they may not have been exactly that, but one of those 5 would come back and it'd be like, you kind of scratch your head and you go, oh, I didn't see that one coming. But it gave you so much insight, and you talk to that customer and say, well, I thought this. No, this is what's really going on. And then you got just tremendous feedback because you're asking for honest feedback. Don't just give me 5s out of 5s because we want to look like we're the best place to work in Colorado, or we're the best place to work in the United States. And you're trying to generate that false sense of what a cool place it is to work, when really every place, it's a 4-letter word called work. I mean, you got to get there and you got to do stuff, right? Again, it's that openness and the communication is so critical. And you tell your customers, hey, I'm struggling. You want this order? I can do this, but this is what it's going to cost. If you did this, this, or this, we can save you here. There's a lot of give and take. If you work with the customer, they're willing to bend a little also.
It's a real partnership, to your point. And you said this earlier, it sounds, it's basic, but there's a lot of organizations or people that don't live that way. They really don't. And so, it's great to hear that you're able to have these deep, meaningful conversations with your clients and become a better organization because of it.
Stanley, what's interesting on this point, Brian and I talk about this all the time, because we're in a definite shift in the way business is getting done with social media and all the online stuff and Slack channels and this, that, and the other. And a lot of times, I think, particularly if you're a younger entrepreneur and you're used to doing all this and you used this channel back at Harvard, and they assume that their customer base is going to adapt to that. And sometimes it's like, hey, I just want to get an email, right? Like I don't work at your company. I'm willing to pay you, but that's a really simple example. But what I think is so instrumental about what you're saying, and that particularly younger entrepreneurs should pay attention to, and we see on the show, is grassroots. Every entrepreneur, that it doesn't matter the industry. We've talked to so many people like you that go, I sat down with the customer. I really, really figured out what is it that the customer wants. And that's kind of what it takes to build a business from the ground up, right? Develop your price point. That requires the kind of learning on your part that I don't think every young entrepreneur probably fully appreciates.
Totally resonate to that. I'll give you an example. I'm a much younger engineer, and I went to a meeting with our chief technologist, not at Oakman, beforehand. And the chief technologist walked in with widget A, and he set it on the table, and there it is. There was no question about what it does, why is it going to help the customer, how much it costs, what it's going to fit into their system of systems, etc. And so again, those are learning moments that everybody should participate in. Why did that meeting go so bad? Well, you weren't asking the customer what they needed. You were giving them something that you thought they needed. It's as basic as that. The customers are going to tell you what they need, what they want. And sometimes they tell you what they want, and it's not really what they need, or vice versa. They tell you what they need, but it's not necessarily what they want. And so you got to work through that fog of implementation and tease out what you're really trying to give them, either from a functional aspect or a performance aspect of the system you're developing.
Another question on that point, Brian and I were talking about. So in the world of entrepreneurs, you have the inventors, scientists, engineers, patent experts. They come up with these brilliant things, right? And a lot of them are so wedded to the technology that they lose complete sight of, hey, let's figure out what our price point is. How do we sell this thing? How do we capitalize correctly? Because that matters a lot, that you don't shoot yourself in the foot along the way. What I'm kind of saying is not every scientist per se is a great business person. And in your industry, in the space industry, you have this intricate blend, right? And the needle's got to be threaded between great business person, great technology scientist. So how do you find the right people? And what's your kind of advice and your experience in seeing that dichotomy? And for folks that are in technical industries to go, hey, here's how you got to work both hats, and here's how you make it work and how you make money at the end of the day.
It's a couple of things. You tripped on a story for, again, we had an incredible chief technologist who has since passed away, Dr. Jay Wilson. I mean, he was just phenomenal. And he would come up with the coolest, most awesome idea in some of these boutique payloads. And we'd go and we'd get it sold. And then he'd say, well, I don't know if we're going to be able to make this work. And you're like, okay, we have a contract now. But the funny part about it is the team, engineering and chief scientist, we always worked through those things. And I think that pushed the boundary. So, I mean, that's the nightmare, lead, and the funny part about it is, so Maureen was our CEO. I was president and chief systems engineer. So she was sort of the running all of the ops, the operations of it. And I was doing sort of the program management and all that. And between the two of us, we'd pull our hair out because we'd have these super cool ideas. And then 2 minutes later, it's like, no, we can't do that. But we'd end up doing it. And so it's pulling the rabbit out of the hat's one thing. So that I'm not sure I answered your.
I think that was a perfect demonstration.
But the other thing that we did at OAI is we put everybody through strength finders, and you find out who are, like, I'm a visionary and analytic, and I see things before they happen. And Maureen's very much the social, personal interaction and operation. I mean, you can just see it. But then all of our people that took these, we'd actually put your 5 top strengths on the door jamb of your office so that when people walked in, you knew what their 5 strengths were and you talked to those strengths, not to your strengths. And I think a lot of that communication is how you bridge that gap between wild entrepreneurial idea versus physics versus engineering, production, and operations. And I think you have to understand everybody in your organization, as well as everybody that is either providing, the stakeholders, the suppliers, the customers, and all of those things. And so, again, I really believe you have to make sure you're communicating to the way that they're hearing you, not the way you think you're talking to them.
That's really thoughtful. That's very thoughtful. I mean, everybody has almost like their own language in a way. So,
well, emotional intelligence
right.
is what you're saying.
I don't know about that. My emotional intelligence is low, so
Okay.
So you talk about once these employees and executives are in the door, but as you're scaling the organization, what are the first positions you're hiring for? And then conversely, what are you looking for in these candidates to fill those roles?
Again, early on, you should be looking, and again, this is the way we did it. I'm not saying it's the right way, but what we always did was we tried to find utility infielders. So liken it to baseball. I don't have enough payroll to buy an ace first baseman and an ace third baseman and a shortstop, right? But if I can get a pretty good first baseman that also can play left field, then I can do a twofer and I might be able to move forward with that in the interim. So that to me is sort of early on. And then as you grow, you want people that are going to not only fit into the team. So if I've got 3, shortstops, you don't want to buy another shortstop. But what you want to do is you want to try to find somebody that's going to bolster your bench or your bullpen or. Finding people that can get along is as important as their technical or their social skills, because you can tear a company apart. Every time you hire somebody, the dynamic changes, good, bad, or indifferent, and there are always intended consequences and unintended consequences.
How do you screen for that when you're interviewing these candidates?
So as a successful entrepreneur, I'd say we had a 10-step process to do that. Are you kidding me? We made so many mistakes in that. We would hire people in, and sometimes 6 months later, they didn't want to be in a small or a highly volatile company. And when I mean volatile, just all over the map. We were trying to figure out who we are, where we're going. You got to all that stuff. And so to say that we never made a mistake would be bald-faced lie. We hired
Yeah.
people in and they didn't work out. The key is, and I think I didn't realize this until late, but we actually implemented traction late in our entrepreneurial journey.
Mm-hmm.
But in traction, they were very specific about, gets it, wants it, and has the capacity to do it. And a lot of people get it. A lot of people want it. They don't have the capacity. Or a lot of people want it, but they don't get it. And that still rings to me true today. And it's just, plug for Gino, and I think it's Gino on traction. That's just some basic, thought processes. And then when people don't work out, the one way is you get rid of them. The other way is find where they fit better.
Yeah.
And we worked really hard. We agonized over, ever letting anybody go. So what we would try to do is figure out, well, you can't do this. How about this? Well, you can't do this. How about this? And if you got to third or fourth one and you're still there, probably if they haven't left, it's probably time for them.
So along the lines of, giving folks a second or third chance, did you find that the ones that didn't work out self-selected out because you had such a strong core of talent that, essentially in a startup environment and a high growth environment, it's almost like you got to match that energy. And if you can't, you almost feel like maybe this isn't for me. Do you think that was the case?
On the majority of them,
Yeah.
they decided for themselves that Oakman wasn't the place to work. So, we went through COVID, and this is a great example. We went through COVID, and I was actually on travel doing a customer site training the week that everything shut down. And so on Tuesday, it starts shutting down. On Wednesday, you can't get into any of the restaurants. On Thursday, we cut the training short a day and flew back home Friday morning. The company had closed, basically everybody went remote that Thursday. I think it was like March 17th of 20. And then for the next 4 months, everybody was remote. When we started to try to come back, so Maureen and I were the first two in the office we started back in May, and I was actually traveling again in June of that year on completely empty planes. But we started coming back in June, July, and there were some people that just said, nope, I'm not going to do that. And that was tough because there was no right answer. And
Yeah.
you go talk to your lawyers, and they're saying, well, you're going to get sued one way or another, or you have the potential to be. Thank goodness we didn't. But there were a few people who said, nope, it was an epiphany. I don't want to do this anymore. I want to be remote. And we respected that. But we also had people that had to be on site and doing work. And you got to we were building hardware. We were shipping Acorn.
Right.
You got to turn wrench and you got to do things. And so, everybody thinks, oh, it's just the owners and those crotchety, money grubbing owners. And it's like, we agonized. We agonized over it. We relayed out in the 3 months that we were shut down. We took all of our offices, totally relayed them out, dropped size, dropped the load factor in each one of the offices, moved back people to our old facilities. We were doing all kinds of just crazy stuff to comply with everything that was going on. And there were still people that just said, no, I don't care what you do. I'm not coming back. And when you get those, you got to say, let's agree to disagree, and good luck in the future, and move on.
Yeah. To your point, your business and your industry, it's hard to operate remotely because you have to be there in person. You have to physically be there.
If you talk to the software people, they'll say, oh, I can program anywhere. But the reality is, if the software person's sitting next to the hardware person and they're working through the problems, it's 10 times more efficient than if the hardware person says, I got a problem. They get on the phone with Joe. Joe says, give me a minute. I'm going to go get my computer. It just slows everything down. Is it impossible? No. But at the time, it was just not fair to the hardware people for the software people to be remote, or the biz ops people to be remote. And again, I'm a big fairness guy. So is Maureen, a gal. You agonize over it, but you also have a business to run.
You've brought up Acorn a few times, and I'm interested in learning more there because every organization needs a competitive edge. And it seems like Acorn was that big competitive edge that you had. Was Acorn originally a part of the original 3 business units that you acquired, or was it part of an evolution of sorts based on the work you were doing, customer feedback, all of the above, none of the above? Like,
So the software side of it
Mhm.
came along with the IP that we got in the asset lease purchase agreement. The core of it, the software, the flight software was part of it. The hardware on the side of it, we added, and it was really the impetus of what everybody now calls digital engineering. At the time, we didn't call it digital engineering. It was a high fidelity modeling and simulation environment. So Acorn was if you remember the three business lines we had, that second line was the modeling and simulation environment. That's what turned into Acorn. We put a ton of internal development into it. That's the other thing. When we had downturns, we would not lay people off. We would take them and say, okay, we want to keep you on because we're going to get another contract in. We will spend our own dollars to do IRAD work and develop out better capability of Acorn or some other product to keep moving forward so that we didn't lose that core group of people. And you have the ability to do that when it's your money. It's a lot easier
Yeah.
to spend the money that's in the bank. I will tell you that in what was it, 2013, 2014, we were hanging on by our fingernails. And it was a lot of companies go out of business 2-3 years into it. We were no different, and we hunkered down and we continued to have the vision to move forward, and it took off. And you should see our EBITDA curve. I'll have to send it to you one time. It starts out kind of cool, and then there's just this V drop. Houston, we've got a problem, and then you plow everything back in, and the EBITDA curve takes off. But I think what that taught us was always save money, always have, plow the money back into the business. I've known a lot of entrepreneurs that go out and buy airplanes or, cars or houses, or they take distributions. And my recommendation to any entrepreneur is it's much better if you have a higher percentage of ownership when you do an M&A than it is to pull a car or a boat or an airplane out. And plus, it's easier on the accountants when you do the M&A acquisition or the acquisition.
Some really cool stuff to unpack there. The first thing is I wanted to get into finance, right? So you have the idea or the customers you're working. How did you finance it day to day in those really hard times? Did you take on investors? Was this you and Marine? What take us through that?
We actually, the first year of operations, we actually made $17,000. And every year we would make money. This is the better to be lucky. We didn't even know you could do disbursements. So we just plow back into the business. We took our salaries. Obviously, entrepreneurs that don't take salaries, that's fine. I think you need to take a salary to pay for your basic needs. You don't need to be overly compensated, but you need to be able to pay for your family and live your life and do all of that kind of stuff. Now, put that aside. Everything else goes into, either you save it, you plow back into the company, or you buy capital, capital equipment. And so those were our three tenets on everything we did. And when you had problems, if somebody came off of a contract, we would try like heck to keep them employed doing internal development or a new product or whatever. But from a finance perspective, when it got tough, thank goodness we never had to mortgage houses or other things or run up credit cards. I know many, many entrepreneurs that, tap everything out. We didn't have that problem because we were very fiscally responsible in the good times, and so that we could live through those bad times and come out of it on the other side, it bruised but not mortally wounded.
What was the cause of the downward EBITDA spike originally?
We lost a major customer.
Yeah.
And I mean, those happen. That's the whole reason why you want to have three different, somewhat disparate business lines, or at least the two, so that you don't have it's the old all your eggs in one basket. You can have some ebb and flow in those lines that don't necessarily mortally wound the overall endeavor.
Well, and here's what's kind of where I was going with that is that I know, for example, my business, which is transactional driven for the most part, it's not pump out a will and charge X price, and it's the widget model. Although If we could figure that out, I'd be all for it. But what it means is kind of in a good market, or if luck strings itself together, we can have a really great year. And then other times we can have a really poor year. And what I've come to find is you need those, don't go crazy with your money in those really good years, because you're going to need it in the poor years until you can really get sort of this established, growing, recurring revenue thing. And what part of what I also want to bring up that you're going to is, you could call it product line concentration or customer concentration, right? And I'm sure that now I want to get into that uptick and how you built it back from the ground up, because ultimately you had an exit, even if not planned. And as you know, EBITDA and a stable EBITDA is incredibly important. So now let's go from the bottom. How'd you build it back up, and what was your viewpoint at that?
Great question. As we, we in the dark days, we hunkered down and we focused on Acorn. And the interesting thing is, I'm a hardware guy, and we came to the realization that OAI was, for all intents and purposes, a software company. And as a hardware guy, it just broke my heart. But software, once it's developed, the being able to sell it and the return on those investments is much higher. And so, the hardware is intensive and it takes a lot of effort. So does software. But once you make an application, or once you make a software tool or a developer's kit, it's pennies to push duplicate. It's a license key. It's not another set of metal and sensors and diodes and resistors and everything else that touch labor has to put that together.
Well, that you're creating kind of a recurring revenue scale.
Yeah.
At that point, right? With no increasing marginal cost to get there, which is, Brian, we should have started a software company. If we listen, if we were Stanley, if we were smart enough, we'd invest in you for another recurring revenue subscription-based business.
Yeah. Again, reluctant entrepreneur, did it once and got lucky. I'm a hardware guy, and I think there's still tons of ways to make good money making hardware. And I think it's going to become even more important in the future, especially with a lot of the onshoring work that's going on. I think you're seeing a resurgence in, especially with the new additive manufacturing, 3D printing, and a lot of the new ways of doing manufacture. We're going to onshore a lot of that back to the US. I'm hopeful that manufacturing days are coming back strong. That said, the space economy, which we're sort of moving into that fifth industrial revolution, and the space economy needs both. You can't fly a virtual spacecraft in orbit. It's got to have hardware, right? And you can't put a virtual astronaut in orbit. You gotta get them there somehow. Or her there somehow. So there's this, you've got to have both, and you've got to understand how both of their price and cost structures work. And a lot of people, I think, understand price and they don't necessarily understand cost, which then drives, I'm not making ROI and my EBITDA sucks. Yeah. And it just goes downhill from there. And I say this like I'm this sage, business person. We got it beat into us. We had some really, really good support from our accountants, our CPAs, and everybody else. And the other thing about it is with the work we did with the US government, we had to close our books every month. And so you knew at the end of every month where everything was. I mean, down to, I want to say the penny, but I'd be lying. It was, but we were pretty close. We were pretty darn close. If you have that every month and you go back and look at it, you see trend lines. What happened here? Oh, well, Joe did this or Susie did that, whatever. That gives you insight to forecast future. And once you have that forecasting capability, as long as, there's not a catastrophic event like COVID, you can sort of figure out, yeah, we're going to be X million dollars this year, grow at 5, 10, 15, whatever the percentage is, will be here. And then if you're above that, everything's great. And if you're not, then you got to figure out, okay, how do I twist the knobs a little bit?
So Acorn helps elevate the company from a revenue perspective.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's going gangbusters. You're enjoying it. At what point did you entertain the eventual acquisition? or sale?
So we actually got a phone call. Aerospace is pretty small. One of the guys that we'd worked with, in the past, calls up and says, "Hey, we want to come over and talk." Marina and I are like, "Hey, cool. It's a company down the road." And in Colorado, there's 200 small businesses all doing aerospace. So everybody knows everybody. They're all on Colorado Space Business Roundtable or Colorado Space Coalition, and everybody talks, or they're a CCTW winner, blah, so it's like, yeah, come on over. So they come over, and we're sitting talking, and we're trying to figure out, are you guys going out to bid something? Do you want us to team with you? And it was right out. We'd like to see if you are for sale. And Marina and I looked at each other and said, no, we're not for sale. And that wasn't the right answer, because everybody's for sale. And we started thinking about it, and
So true.
I mean, but it was funny. I mean, we can look at it in hindsight now. It's just, no, we're not for sale. Yeah, you're always for sale. So we started the process. They put out a number that was reasonable. We put out a number. We met right in the middle. And I will tell you, so Redwire and the AE partners, the AE industrial guys that were putting these deals together, Redwire's put 7 companies together in under a year, and they did it. Yeah, just incredible. And so hats off to their team. Did we get wire brushed? Oh yeah, we got wire brushed, but we had a really good team on our side. Our books were clean, and they were being very reasonable in it.
There's so many great nuggets here, even though you didn't intend to sell. So, one of our businesses is getting buyer or sellers ready to sell. And primarily that means work your numbers the way that a buyer is going to look at it and projecting. It's not rocket science. It's just kind of glorified house cleaning, even though you didn't plan to do it because of the nature of what you were doing with government contracts and all of the audits and stuff. You were actually, in a roundabout way, perfectly situating yourself, which I find really interesting. And that made, I'm sure, the dynamic, especially with private equity backed group. We actually did a deal with them, another client who had a transaction with AE Industrial Partners. And the second thing that I think the audience could benefit from hearing on you is the mixology of the partnership, especially when it comes to private equity. You had somebody who did deals in the space routinely. They were focused. That tends to be the right type of partnership, as opposed to a lot of private equity groups that buy all over the place and really making it work. So talk us through that, because I'm sure that's huge when it comes to an event like that.
Oh, sure. So Pete Canito, who is the CEO of Redwire, he and, let's see, who was it? It was, I'll have to get you his name. I apologize. They came in, and they were very reasonable. And in fact, our lawyers, we had a lawyer, and she would team up, or we'd be on conference calls, and, Kirkland and Ellis and 16 other lawyers would be in the room on their side. But they were pretty reasonable about it. And Pete said it this way. He said, you know what? We're trying to do a bunch of these, so it doesn't make sense to be unreasonable. If I'm unreasonable and I have to do it 10 times, 5 of them are going to fall apart, and then we're not going to get where we need to. And it was pure, like you said, it was a pure space play. They were looking to build a middle tier space company out of really successful small companies that were doing space, and they've done that. Redwire's, even regardless of where the SPACs are going right now, they're doing very well. And to see them finally, break from the bringing 10 companies together to move forward, they're doing great. And like I said, I think that mentality of having a good buyer and at least a reasonable seller, because we weren't an excited seller, but we got excited. I think that works out, and it's a good win-win, because they weren't being unreasonable. We tried not to be unreasonable. We met a dead center in the middle, and everybody got happy about it.
What's the emotional roller coaster look like as you're going through this transaction? Is it pretty consistent? Are you not trying to get too far ahead of yourself, or are you already thinking about what retirement might look like at the time?
All over the map. And the funny part about it, so this is, I'll give you a little personal thing. The OAI logo was designed and developed by my niece, and I actually have it tattooed on my arm.
Nice.
So that's commitment. So we're going through it, and they say, "Well, we want the logo." I'm like, "Well, I kind of have it tattooed on me, so it's personal." And we worked through it to where, from as long as it's not for aerospace use, we can use it. And so it's that give and take.
Yeah.
But that was a sticking point that nobody would have ever thought about, right? And we're coming down and we're arguing over. I paid $300 to my niece who worked as a graphic artist to put it together. It's the only piece of art she has on somebody's body, and it was important, right? And so it was. I mean, it's just weird stuff like that.
Stanley, did they put into the contract that one of the conditions of you being able to sport that on your body is you couldn't go to the beach and be walking around in public because that might be, I'm kidding.
No, like I said, everything that's going on, Redwire was tremendous through it all. And in fact, Maureen and I stayed on through the transition. I became part of corporate as the chief architect, and we helped continue to move Redwire forward. So when we left, it was very amiable. And like I said, it's a good company. It's going to do great things. And it's going to do great things because a lot of the founders set up some of these really critical technologies that they're now capitalizing on in a bigger environment. They're a bigger fish in this aerospace pond, and they're going to do great things in orbit now and in the future. So it was all positive.
That's great. And so, how long did you stay retired for, Stanley?
I don't think I ever really retired. So I do a bunch of STEM outreach. So I'm the student competition lead at SmallSat. I got a call from the founder of the Space Force Cadet Corps, asked me to help him out. We started helping him out. He asked me to be the chairman of the board for the first year. I've done that. They're going to have board elections here end of the year. I told him if the board wants me to stay, I'll stay. If they want me to leave, I'll salute smartly and move over. We're doing this ground station up here in Michigan for Lake Superior State University, and we're training mission engineers and mission controllers. Now it's the fun,
That's what I was going to ask, is because now that you have this financial freedom, you're able to refocus on what inspires you in cultivating or shaping that next generation of space enthusiasts, right? And so that's been I'm certainly enjoyable for you at this stage, right?
It's fun, and you do it until it's not fun, and then you say no.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is. We're having a good time, and I will tell you, I can't. I've been up here for 2 weeks helping put this ground station together. I'd love to. I'll send you some pictures of it. I walked you through it a little bit earlier, but I mean, it's rocking. And the only way I could do that is because Marine is a incredible partner that allows me to take off for 2 weeks and do good things for the next generation.
For us that are novices in the space industry, right? Now you're starting to see it kind of going more mainstream. SpaceX, Elon Musk, us lay people think of space and spaceships and all that kind of stuff. And NASA, take us through with today things becoming a little more mainstream. SpaceX, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and all the other things seems like it's becoming more, commercial, if you will. What's the future going to be there?
Yeah, it's exciting. So I mean, I've been living it for many decades, and so we're already into the fifth industrial revolution, and space is going to continue to play a bigger role. I think you're going to see lunar exploration. You're already seeing a lot of activity going on, at the moon, but also starting to look out to Mars and moving out into the interplanetary systems. The driver there, it's the economy, and it's the space economy. There's money to be made. I think you're going to continue to see low Earth orbit, where NASA used to run the International Space Station. They're now trading off to commercial space stations. And this is where it should be. NASA should be doing the hard stuff that doesn't have a true return on investment. Once the return on investment is proven, then you turn that over to the commercial folks and let them make money and do it sustainably. So don't space junk and do all the stuff that we used to do back in the 70s and 80s. Do it responsibly, but grow that economy out commercially, because that's what commercial is supposed to do. Space Force is supposed to protect and be guardians, good stewards NASA is supposed to explore and do things that doesn't have a direct ROI, but it provides some science and some, science of the origins and things like that. Let the commercial folks do what the commercial folks do well, which is build starships that are going to go and land on the moon and build in space assembly, manufacture, all the servicing work that's going on. And I think that's how things are developing out now. So as long as we continue to do that and do it responsibly, I think it's a good thing. Space is no different than maritime or airspace or underwater or land. There's going to be conflict in it. There's going to be contention in it. And, you got to make sure that you're doing it for the right reasons. But there's also a tremendous opportunity and a boom for commercial side if it's done properly.
Stanley, I want to talk a little bit about resilience. You mentioned the only difference between success and failure is getting up one more time after you're knocked down. Can you give us some more memorable examples of when you felt you were knocked pretty hard to the canvas and you had to fight your way to get back up again?
Yeah, definitely. Without mentioning any names, I had a dear friend who at the time was on another team and a competitor, and we had a really good product. We lost that competition. I mean, it strained that relationship significantly, and that's the tough thing. You talk about resilience. He was what I would refer to as a competitor. Sometimes he's your competitor, sometimes he's your teammate, and how you interact with that is super important. And unfortunately, and I'd love to say that we're still best friends. Unfortunately, it didn't work out, and we haven't talked since that. I mean, it was brutal. That one I think of as a failure on my side. You still got to keep moving forward. That dug a little bit, and not so much that we lost, but that I lost a really good friend in that loss. So that's almost a double whammy. And what do? You get up and you suit back up and you get back in the game and you move on. But I will tell you, it's hard because in this business, if you can go out afterwards, you don't have to go out afterwards and have a beer with them, but if you can, it's 10 times better.
Yeah, the other thing too I know that you'll agree with this. There's a lot of inspirational quotes that say, hey, you get knocked down 8 times, get up 9, whatever, but you know that there were points where you were literally probably down and out, ready to pull the plug. And in business and entrepreneurship, there's a thing to momentum, right? There's a thing to that. Keep grinding, and then bam, the momentum shifts, right?
It can be negative too. The momentum on the way down is as powerful as the momentum on the way up. The other thing, again, this is having somebody that maybe a little off cycle and can help you when you're down. There were many times where I'm like, man, this is too hard. And Maureen would be like, nah, we can do this. Or vice versa. She'd be like, this has been the worst week of the year, and we got many more on the horizon. And I'd be like, nah, come on, we can keep doing this. I think your support structure is as important as your technology, as your team, as everything. And your team is your support structure. I don't know how to characterize it.
100%. I mean, and let's go further with that. What about your family support structure?
Oh, big time.
Also,
yeah,
right, because they're in it with you.
Yeah, and again, I think that there's opportunity to leverage that support in the really tough times, but you also need to fill. We always called it the reservoir of trust, right? You can drain that reservoir for so long, and if you don't put back into that reservoir, it goes dry, and then it gets ugly quickly. So it's a two-way. When times are good, you should be filling it up, and when times are bad, you can rely on that reservoir, but never drain it dry.
This has been amazing. I can't believe the nuggets of powerful information that you've just dispensed in kind of a novel, mysterious industry. And we can tell that you are a true dawn of the space industry, Stanley. You're a mafioso. We're in every sense of the word, every good sense of the word. And we're really glad that you came on today. I guess As we sort of wind this down, you've already given a bunch. What's the one thing you'd like to leave with our entrepreneur and aspiring entrepreneur listeners that they should take away from your incredible journey?
Don't let school interfere with your education. I think that's a takeaway. But the other one is don't take yourself too seriously. And every now and then take a Friday off or take a week off, and it'll be there. It'll be there when you get back. I don't subscribe to that advice. Many times I didn't. As you get older, you figure out a lot more. I think that age comes wisdom. And what's the saying? Nobody ever has on their headstone, he didn't work hard enough, or he didn't,
Right.
he wasn't,
Yep.
he wasn't there, whatever it is. And it's just being a late stage, reluctant entrepreneur is much, much different than a headstrong, I can do it. And I'm dealing with one of those right now in terms of some advisor role that we're working with. And he's got incredible energy, but it's shiny bauble syndrome. He's all over the map and he wants to do things that he may not understand how to do it. And what you need to do sometimes, having a mentor be able to say, hold on, that's the other thing, get good mentors. I had fantastic mentors. So get a couple of good mentors, call them early and often, because they will help you through those good times and bad times so that your head doesn't get too big or that you don't go totally into the tank.
Sound advice. Stanley, really appreciate the time today. It's good seeing you, and all my best on the continued success.
Hey, you bet. And great talking with both of you today. This is fun stuff now.
Thank you, Stanley. Appreciate it.
All right.